The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, and welcome to the webinar. Today we will be discussing school emergency response plans and the active shooter. My name is David Martin, and I will be your moderator today. A little bit about LENSEC. Since 1998, LENSEC has been a trusted security and surveillance partner with experience in the USA and around the world. LENSEC has a background working with many types of industries, and we help customers develop enterprise solutions for complex physical security projects. We've developed a powerful security platform called Perspective Video Management Software. And this is an enterprise VMS which streams and captures IT security video and incorporates video analytics, access control, RFID, and more into the software. And I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. First, I need to go over a few logistics for the webinar. We'll be taking questions during the webinar, and you can enter those questions on your GoToWebinar panel, generally found at the bottom of your panel. We'll collect those during the presentation, and then we'll answer the questions at the end of the event. Also, we'll present poll questions during the event. You'll see that pop up with a question, and we encourage your participation in answering these questions when they are presented. And at the end of the webinar, we'll present a survey for all the attendees. We'll ask that you answer a few quick questions to help us better serve you in future webinar events. If you're interested in a completion certificate for today's webinar, just indicate your wishes on the survey. We'll follow up in a few days after the webinar with certificate, answers to the questions, and a copy of the presentation. Also, we record these webinars and post them on our website, lensec.com, and we'll provide you with a link to the webinar video archive so you can see this one and past webinars as well. LENSEC sponsors these webinars monthly, and we cover a variety of safety and physical security information. So check back with us often to find out what's coming up next in our Steps into Security webinar series. So today's physical security expert is Gary Sigrist. He's a nationally known speaker, consultant, author, and expert on emergency preparedness. During his 30-year career, he has been an educator, administrator, and police officer. Gary's background gives him a unique point of view on safety and preparedness in education environments. He is president and CEO of Safeguard Risk Solutions. The company helps its clients identify vulnerabilities, plan accordingly, train thoroughly, and respond effectively. Gary, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for being with us here today. I'd like to thank LENSEC for sponsoring this free webinar, and those of you that are taking time out of your busy days. I know what it's like to be an educator this time of year, and time is of the essence. So if we could get started, we're going to talk about a couple of things here. We're going to talk about the relationship between the schools and first responders. We're going to look at ERPs. We're going to talk about training, lockdown. We'll talk a little bit about law enforcement response to active shooters. Something that came up in after the Belgium attacks. A lot of our clients contacted us because of field trips, and so we thought that as you move into the next year, as field trips are being planned, you're able to take a look at some of the things that you're doing and maybe make some improvements. So, Keith, if you'll give me the, okay, you're going to do the survey first. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is our first poll question, and the question then is, when was the last time you reviewed or updated the school's emergency response plan? So you'll have a few selections there, which is never, you're reviewing it now, less than a year, 2 to 5 years ago, or over 5 years ago. And we'll give you a few moments to make your selection, and then we'll look at the results. And the results should be coming in here shortly. There we go. So it looks like most of the group here today, 55%, has updated less than a year. There's a few that never have looked at the emergency plan, 11%. 18 of you are reviewing it now, and 11 at 2 to 5 years, and just 5% over 5 years ago. And we'll let Gary speak to that real quick.
You know, the two best answers that I see up there are less than a year and reviewing now. A lot of people tend to think that once you have your emergency response plans finished, then you're done. You can put them on the put them in a 3-ring binder, put them on the shelf in the office, and then ignore them. And in reality, we should be reviewing them on a regular basis, both as if you're an incident commander, and then also if you are with your staff as well. And you know, one of the reasons why we talk about this is that things change, so plans have to change. And one of the first things we always recommend is if there's been an incident somewhere in the United States or around the world that impacts safety and primarily school safety, bad guys are constantly changing their strategies to adapt to the way law enforcement adapts their strategies. And so we want to make sure that our plans are the current best practices. So as we're going to begin, this is a bit of a review from a webinar we did back in February of last year. You will have copies of this presentation. I know a lot of people say, I wish I had a copy now. Let's focus more on just kind of listening and reading, and then we don't go away. LENSEC will be here for a long time. I'll be here for a long time. So if you have questions after the webinar, even tomorrow or next week, you can shoot us an email and we'll answer those questions. But one of the things that I think is most important when you talk about emergency response plans are the fact that the superintendent, the dean of the school, the president of the university, you know, the first time you exchange business cards with the fire chief and the police chief should not be at the scene of an incident. You should already have a working relationship with all of your first responders, and not just fire and police. You know, your boards of health, your county emergency management. You need to know these people. And when I was the director of safety for a school district in the state of Ohio, we were fortunate enough to have a grant. And when we were doing our gap analysis, one of the things that we realized very quickly is we weren't working very well with first responders. Now, that grant started back in 2008, and one of the things that we started was monthly meetings with first responders. And to this day, you know, 8 years after the grant has been over, Southwestern City School District is still having those monthly meetings with first responders just to constantly review plans, talk about strategies. So, you know, when we look at how does that happen, you know, you as a district, you as a university, you as a daycare center, you know, when you do your needs assessment and gap analysis, you develop those project goals and you develop budgets and timelines. And then you start calling your first responders. And, you know, we can say start at the chief's office, but, you know, with the city of Columbus, you know, we couldn't start directly with the chief. We started with the community liaison officers, and they were the ones that got us in contact with the people who could attend our meetings. And then once we started that process, you know, we started with an agenda and we set future meetings. And to this day, as I said earlier, we still meet the first Wednesday of every month just to discuss safety issues. Because when we look at our first responders in schools, we have congruent goals. Everyone is concerned about the safety of the students and staff. What schools tend to forget is schools are subject matter experts when it comes to educating children and young adults. First responders are subject matter experts on emergencies. And so that leads us to have training opportunities with them and also positive community relations. I've been told by chiefs of police in some of the communities that I work with and the fire chiefs that if there's an event that occurs somewhere in the United States, inevitably they get a phone call from a parent in their community and they said, is my child's school prepared? It is such a positive thing when the fire chief and the police chief can say, yes, we helped your child's school create their plans. So some of the things that our first responders are going to need is they're going to need maps of our areas. Now, I'm going to admit that when I started in law enforcement, we were still carrying revolvers, PR-24s, and we didn't have strobe lights on the top of our cruisers. We had rotators. and every one of us in our clipboard, because we still carried clipboards, had a map of all the schools. In some states now, these maps are available online through the officer's MDT. The first responders need to know how the schools are going to respond, and what's nice is if the first responders help write the plans, they're already halfway through the challenge of knowing how the school is going to respond in an emergency. We talk about training opportunities. Here we were working at a brand new elementary school, and we were working with first responders. In the state of Ohio, as with many states, you know, if everyone's using CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, the schools themselves are almost impossible to get into once the school day has started. So what we were talking about is if we had to breach a door, which doors would be the best to breach. And that was all part of it. Working with law enforcement officers, you know, this training piece of how do we move through the halls, how do we breach doors, how do we move upstairs. If you as a law enforcement agency, and I know that there are law enforcement agencies that are listening today, and your school partners, it is so important that your officers train in the schools, because what we found as we were doing this training, you know, a lot of officers, you know, remember their training when going through an apartment searching for people. And in a school, we tend to forget that we have to use those same strategies, so that use of cover and covering officers, so that we can enter safely and find the bad guy safely. So we talk about exercises, and when we talk about our emergency response plans, and I have a friend of mine who develops exercises all across the United States, and he constantly reminds me that if you're a school or a business or a college and you have the greatest emergency response plan, but you've never exercised that plan, then really all you have is a theory. And what I like about this exercise we did at Southwestern City Schools was one of the subject matter experts, then Captain Saltzman of the Columbus Bomb Squad, for the fire department, he helped us write our bomb threat protocols. And then he said, you know, I think I can get you additional grant funding, which he did through Ohio Homeland Security, and we were able to then do a tabletop and a full-scale exercise to test the plans that we wrote. We had 6 law enforcement agencies, 4 fire agencies. We had students who were bad guys. We had everything going on, and not only was it a great exercise for the school, but it was also a great public relations tool for both the school and all the first responders. So when we look at developing our emergency response plan, obviously we're going to have to make sure that we use the National Incident Management System, and that is ICS. We use ICS. It has to be all hazards. And when I talk about all hazards, I'll go over this quite a few times. If you talk to many schools today, their #1 concern is the active shooter, and that is a real threat. But in reality, you're more likely to have a child break their arm during recess. You're more likely to have a child with a nut allergy. You're more likely to have a drunk parent at parent-teacher conferences than you are for an active shooter. So we must train our staff to respond to all emergencies, not just the active shooter. So, I was a science teacher. That's how I started. So I can throw some science stuff in, and I say nature abhors a vacuum, and so does emergency management planning. Again, you must, as a school, work with your first responders. First responders, you cannot go in and dictate how a school is going to respond. Both groups, schools and first responders, have expertises in certain fields, and schools are the experts at taking care of children during the day and educating them. And although the police officer in me would sometimes say we should be doing, these things in school to keep the kids safe, the school teacher said, man, if we, put armed guards in every hallway, that wouldn't necessarily make the kids feel more safe. It actually might frighten them more. So that's why you strike that balance of both groups working together so that we can accomplish the same goals. We also included our chambers of commerce were on the team. Anybody who really we felt was a stakeholder, we invited to our meetings. So when we look at what schools need, schools personnel, school administrators are not incident commanders by training. They're not first responders by training. So what we developed is how do we get them through the first 15 minutes before first responders arrive. Now, I live in Franklin County in Columbus, Ohio, and so when I say 15 minutes, that's pretty much a long time for most responses. In some communities, it might be 20 minutes before first responders can arrive. I was doing some work down in New Mexico, and they said some of their schools are so rural, it could be an hour before first responders arrive. So what you have to do is you have to train the incident commander on scene, who may not be trained as an incident commander. They have a training in education, how they should react in the first 15 minutes. And then we need to move into unified command as soon as first responders arrive on scene. And because we're talking about an educational environment, we need to then get the school back to normal as quickly as possible in the recovery piece. So I'll use bomb threat, for example. This is a chart that we developed for building principals, assistant principals, whoever the incident commander is, and it helps them move through the process of what to do. I use this one because it's a little bit more complicated, because you're going to act differently if it's a specific threat versus a general threat, if a device is found, if the device is not as found. We include with that what we call an event aid. In these event aids, because again, our incident commander is not trained as a first responder. If they need reference material, what do I do if it's a phone threat? What do I do if it's an email threat? How do we search? What's my custodian supposed to do? What's my safety officer supposed to do? So it provides a reference for the first responders. So this is a little bit easier to see in the larger box. One of the things that we like about this, I'll see if I can get fancy and use a spotlight, is this right here, the closure. This is the piece that gets us back to the business of being in schools. If you look down here, and of course this isn't all the threats, but this is what we mean by all hazards. It's more than just the active shooter. Let's see, I gotta get out of that, I think. Here again, this is just showing you a little bit larger view so you can see what you're supposed to do. Because you're going to get a copy of this PowerPoint, you could actually take this information and put it into your own plans. We at the time were putting it into a spiral notebook so that they kept it in a safe place, and if they needed it, they could access it. And it was also in a PDF so they could access it online. So how did our first responders, assist with it? Well, they were the content expert. They helped us with fire codes. They got us different resources that we could use, and anything from mobile command centers from the sheriff's office to water supply from the county EMA. They were our community advocates. They were the ones that helped us sell ideas to the parents. And when it came to training, we did the tabletop exercise, we did the full-scale exercise, we allowed first responders to do their own exercises in our buildings, using our buildings, which then accomplished two purposes. It trained their officers, it got their officers familiar with our buildings. We found out during a security and vulnerability assessment that most of our people didn't even have fire extinguisher training. And so we were able to get our local fire departments to train our staff members in how to use a fire extinguisher. So we come up with the second poll question. I do not know how many fire departments are on today. I know that the NFPA sets the standards, and then it takes a couple of years before the NFPA codes make it into your state codes. But the question is, according to the NFPA, when is the only time you do not have to have a fire drill? So the questions I see are up there.
So we'll give you a few minutes to make your selection. To the question, according to the NFPA fire code, when is the only time you do not have to do a fire drill? During class transitions, during lunch, or during a test? And again, we'll give you a few minutes here to make your selection.
I'm sorry, those of you that didn't realize that there would be a quiz today and you didn't have time to study.
Yeah, and I think the results should be coming up for us here, and we'll go over those in just a minute. Okay, there they are. So, according to the NFPA Fire Code, when is the only time you do not have to do a fire drill? And 67% selected during a test, and then several during lunch, during class transitions, and 0 during class.
And the correct answer is NFPA says you do not have to give a fire drill during lunch. The big change the last time the code changed was that you have to have a fire drill during a transition period. The transition period would be class change, when students aren't with their teachers. For those of us that are still young enough to remember what a fire drill was like, it generally happened during class. We lined up at the door. The teacher had us head out the door. We took attendance. The problem is, what do you do during lunchtime when students aren't with the teacher, or when there are class changes, when the students don't know whether to go back to their last class or go on to their next class? And fire drills themselves can be a whole other topic. But the one thing that the NFPA did say is you don't have to do it during lunch. Now, my recommendation is, because you're probably going to have a fire drill during lunch anyways because the kid's going to pull the alarm, is wait until May of the school year. And the reason I say May of the school year is because by that time local and national testing is over. And if your school lunch period ends at 1 o'clock, at 12:59 when you know that every child has finished their lunch, then I would do a fire drill so that people can see what it looks like at lunchtime. So that's my advice on that. Here's fire extinguisher training going on, and this was a great, our fire department loved this because they got out into the schools. Our employees loved it because many of them were not juvenile delinquents, so they never set off a fire extinguisher, so it gave them a chance to see what it was really like. So this was a great activity for us. When we talk about drills, and we use the word drills, and I sometimes think exercise, but you know, some of your drills are mandated by state or federal laws or fire code. You know, we have to have one fire drill the first 10 months, or within the first 10 days of school, and then one fire drill every month thereafter. We have to have one tornado drill during every month of tornado season. In the state of Ohio, we have to have lockdown drills. But there are a lot of drills that we could do that could just kind of prepare us for any kind of event. And so try to look beyond just that one kind of drill, because we need to have our staff and our students practice for things that are likely to occur. So obviously it's got to meet your state guidelines. We should be using the incident command system. It should be age appropriate, and we should make it available to parents. I have, without a doubt, one of the weirdest jobs because of the phone calls that I sometimes get. I received a call once from a county sheriff. A superintendent contacted him, and the drill that she wanted to run was she wanted an undercover deputy to get into the school and then fire off a starter pistol during the school day just to see how people would respond. That has bad idea written all over it, and you know, I went to the meeting with the sheriff and the superintendent, and I brought the evidence of schools that had done that and it ended poorly. So you got to make sure that you're doing the right thing and having good drills as well. We talk about fire drills, for example, and you know, fire drills really aren't very realistic. Even if they're in college settings, they're not very realistic. If we look at college fires, one of the trends that we are seeing that's positive is fewer students are being injured or dying in dorm fires, but we're still seeing a lot of off-campus injuries and deaths due to fires. So we have to make sure that we do training, and it's got to be realistic. Now, I'm not saying let's get a smoke machine out or get a fog machine out, but let's try to make it so that our students are aware that they might not have a teacher with them. There may be smoke, and I know that in Ohio, quite a few of the fire departments have what's called safety time, where they do have small houses that the children can practice getting out of. And that's a great thing to do when you develop that partnership with schools and first responders, is we can make time for that to happen, for the fire department to be involved in some realistic training for the children. So the question always comes is, what about lockdown drills? And the thing is if you're looking at kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, maybe even fourth grade, depending on the child, you don't need to tell them why you're doing a certain activity. You're saying that this is a drill that we do kind of like a fire drill, and it just prepares us for if things bad might happen. With your older children, you can have those age-appropriate conversations. When I was a teacher, I taught 8th grade, and so when we would do our drills and our exercises, we would have those conversations. Okay, we know why we're doing this, but what if? What if somebody was trying to get in the room? Would we be allowed to break a window to go out? What if you're in the restroom when this happens? And, are you allowed to run outside the building if that's going to be the safest place for you to be? Now, the area where most schools are not doing best practices is we're not talking to parents about the drills and giving parents talking points for their children. There are some organizations, some schools that advocate teaching children to fight, and I'm not going to debate that at all. But if so, you better have that conversation with the parents, because what if that goes against what the parents' wishes are? And so that's where you help the parents have that conversation with the children, very much like when you did stranger danger talks with them. Again, when we talk about lockdown procedures, it's a whole other webinar. We talk about the 3 outs: lock out, get out, take out. We talk about the use of barricading, but not barricades. We talk about delay, deter, deny. We show schools how to use things that they already have that could be used in barricading a door. We don't advocate going out and buying barricades because, again, statistically, you're not likely to use that barricading device, and it could be used by a student to commit a crime in the building as well. Who has the authority to call a lockdown? How would you do a lockdown in the cafeteria? What about during class change? These are things that, most schools, because they want to be compliant with the law, but they're not committed to security. If we look at a lot of school shootings, they actually start in the cafeteria at the beginning of the day. You can't do a lockdown there. So what do you tell your children to do? What would happen if you had a person in the hallway at class change between 4th and 5th period? They didn't necessarily have a firearm with them, but it's a drunk, angry adult who's screaming that he wants to see a teacher because he's going to do physical harm to that teacher. So have you trained your staff members for what to do in that situation? In Ohio, we do theoretical exercises during staff meetings, and these theoretical exercises don't have to take more than 15 minutes, but when I was in the police academy from day one, they taught us to think, what if, what if, what if? And what we need to do is we need to start training our staff and our students to have that same kind of mindset. What if this happened? What are our choices? So when we look at lockdown notifications, what's the school response to a lockdown, and then what's going to be the law enforcement response? And this is probably old news for a lot of people, but if we look at what an active shooter is, and when I use the term active shooter, I'm not using the term to describe a drive-by shooting in the neighborhood. I'm not using that term to describe a shooting at 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning when some gang members are playing basketball at a school. That's not an active shooter event. I'm talking about where someone's goal is to kill or hurt as many people as possible. If we look at Sandy Hook, if we look at Virginia Tech, if we look at Platte Canyon, Colorado, if we look at, all of these places, the goal was, I'm going to kill as many people as possible. It wasn't, I'm going to shoot this guy that owes me drug money, I'm going to shoot this one person who did harm to me. I'm here to do mass killings. Someone gave me some statistics the other day that since 2013 there's been 171 school shootings. There may have been 171 shootings that were near a school, but that didn't make them active shooter events. So If we look at these, what an active shooter is, we understand that law enforcement, because this is an event where somebody is killing as many people as possible, it changes the way that we respond. Now, this slide here, we talk about our threat assessment training, because we know that these are the stages of when people go through in an active shooter event. It's not a sudden event. It is a well-planned event that starts with conception, thinking about killing people. It's difficult to detect because we can't read somebody's mind, but it is possible that somebody could say something that says, I want to kill Mr. Sigrist. That's called leakage. And then as they get into the planning stage and they become more specific, who, what, where, and when, what kind of weapons am I going to use? Maybe this is where we find that journal. This is where we can find more leakage. And then in the preparation stage, they're going to be gaining weapons, and there's going to be overt leakage. And in every school shooting, somebody knew something. They were told by the shooters, don't come to school tomorrow, or if you come to school tomorrow and you stand up in the balcony, you'll be able to watch this take place. And then the approach is when they're on their way to school, and the implementation, they're right at the door. That's too late. We want to try to stop an active shooter event at the conceptualization, planning, and preparation. So, what are some of the things that we talk about? First of all, in schools, in your colleges, at your workplace, you have to have a way that people can talk about what their concerns are to a trusted person in the organization. So, let them know that it's someone to talk to. Let them know that if their friend's thinking about committing suicide, that we need to get them help. Sometimes they're not just joking. Sometimes they're really serious. And the problem is, with so many of these events ending in suicide, that could be a warning that that person's thinking about committing a horrific crime and then committing suicide. We recommend, some states it's mandated by law, you have a way of mandatory reporting. Oops, just didn't mean to do that, sorry. So, if we look at, the active shooter events, before Columbine, officers set up a perimeter, SWAT team arrived, made entry. Police were on scene immediately at Columbine, but it took an hour for SWAT to get in, and in that time, people were being killed. Quad started, and I believe it started in Columbus, Ohio, but it was quick action deployment. Now we had 4-man teams, moved in diamond formation, moved to the shooter. Our whole goal was to stop the shooter. We would step over injured people in order to do that, and that bothered a lot of parents. We told them that we weren't going to help the children who were injured because, from a law enforcement standpoint, every time we hear a gunshot, that means that somebody's being injured. So our thought is, let's stop that from happening. So Homeland Security came out with something called LASER, the Law Enforcement Active Shooter Emergency Response. It was designed for small departments who may not have 4 officers on scene. And so we use 2 officer teams. If you have 3 officers, it's 1 3-man team. If you have 4 officers, it's 2 2-man teams. However, that being said, we also know that if I'm the first officer on the scene, I hear gunfire at the door, and even if my backup is 30 seconds away, gunfire means people are killing. We teach SOLO, or SORATIS is what it's called here in Ohio, single officer response teams to an active shooter. We go on at one-man teams, and really, so many of these events end as soon as police arrive. When the bad guy commits suicide, what we're trying to do is increase the speed of suicide. I'm showing you these. This is laser training going on right here. I know that it says that you should be wearing your uniform, and these officers aren't wearing uniforms, and that's because it's training. I say that in part also because there are some agencies that are they're using technology that will allow officers off duty to self-dispatch to the scene of a active shooter event. And your department policy is your department policy, but we know that when we've done force training where we use simunition, we've had officers in uniform be shot by other officers in uniform simply because they focused on the gun and not the person when they were doing the active shooter training. So, our thing is this. This is, probably the biggest switch for law enforcement was the fact that the active shooter event, we went from protect and serve to seek and destroy. And an active shooter event is an active shooter event until the person is down. And so if you're justified in shooting the person, obviously you're justified in using deadly force. Some of the things that we talk about too are, the how do we know when the lockdown is over? And, we tell people to ignore the announcements. We tell them to ignore the fire alarm. A lot of our schools are using their mass notification system so that they can receive a mass notification on their cell phone. We recommend that to use emails from outside the school building that it's happening in, because obviously if your principal leaves their email system up and running, the bad guy can send an email that says, hey, it's safe, everyone come outside, when really that's not safe. But if it comes from the district service center or the central office, then that will allow people to know that it truly is safe. And that was part of the training we did after Sandy Hook, because people didn't believe the police when they were outside the door. We talk about unbarricade, but don't unlock your doors. Officers use keys. Everyone's a threat. We teach our high school and our middle school teachers that when police are coming in the building, when police are coming in the rooms, you need to impress upon your children to lay on the floor and keep their hands visible, and that the students are going to need to follow the orders of the officers. Some of our clients are also using red card, green card to allow for a triage. That red card or green card is used after they've been notified that the shooter is down and law enforcement is coming in. Green card means that there's no one injured in our room. Red cards mean that somebody is injured in our room. And those of you that practice the Platinum 10 and the Golden Hour, we know that we've got to get to the injured students as quickly as possible if we're going to have them survive their gunshot wounds. So let's go to our next poll question. How many of you guys have an emergency response plan for off-site travel or field trips?
And you'll see the selections there, yes, no, or you don't know. And again, we'll just wait a few minutes as you select your answer.
And I apologize for busting through that as quickly as I did. That's usually about an hour presentation. You will get the PowerPoint, and again, I remind you that if you have questions about what you heard or what you're seeing on the PowerPoint and you want clarification, you'll have our contact information, you'll have my contact information, and you can contact me by phone or email, and I'll gladly answer your questions.
And the majority answered do you have an ERP for off-site travel or field trips? 35% had no, and 35% not sure. 26% said they did.
Okay, so again, this is an issue, and just like you had an emergency response plan for your building itself, you should have a smaller plan for your classrooms, and then you should even have one for your bus drivers, so that and the teachers, your chaperones, your coaches, they should all know what the transportation plans are as well in case something happens to a driver. But so these plans here for your transportation are the normal ones that you have when you're using your district or your college's transportation. So when we look at sporting events, it's usually local across town. Field trips are zoos, museums, etc. And then we have a lot of travel around the United States and sometimes abroad. And so we need to have plans for those as well. Now, sporting events are really are pretty easy because just of the nature of our sporting events. Already, again, you should have your district transportation plan. We've already had the medical forms that are completed before the athletes even begin. All of our coaches have to have sports medicine training. Now, when you travel to another school, you need to make sure that the school has a plan. What are their lockdown areas? What do they do during a severe event? If you are a coach, your responsibility is to your athletes, and that is all. You are not responsible for spectators, parents, etc. You need to make sure you get your athletes to those safe areas. When we go to a field trip, such as the zoo, for example, permission slips, emergency medical cards, medicines, and this includes, and I'm not a nurse, but I know that PRN means as needed. So if a parent is brought to the school aspirin for their child to use as needed, you need to make sure that you take that on the field trip. You need to make sure that the adults, the chaperones, they have training for administering medicine. They should have first aid training as well, basic first aid training. For a lot of us, we have BCON, bleeding control training. I'm a range medical officer. I'm a combat medic. I know that Band-Aids just don't go sticky side down. There's more to it, but they should have at least basic first aid training. And then we need to train our students. What do you do if you're lost, and what do you do if you're injured? The worst thing we could have is a child get injured, not tell us, and then go home to their parents and they become injured. So the field trip site where you're going to, we're really lucky, because I don't care if it's a zoo or an airport or a hotel. Those areas already have emergency response plans. Now, what they might not have are lockdown areas. They should have severe weather and event plans. And it's the chaperones, again, who are responsible for the students. So that's where you need to know from the event, where do we go during an emergency. If you're going on a trip, it's best to have a thumb drive with the student photos. And in today's digital age, most schools get electronic copies of all their students' pictures, and we take every student's pictures. If you have a lost or missing child, you want to be able to give first responders, police, the event security, you want to be able to give them a picture of that child so that they know who to look for. The students should have school information and chaperone phone numbers, so that if they get lost, they can say, this is my school, and this is my school's phone number, and this is my chaperone's phone number. Parents should also be given the school information and the chaperone's phone numbers. I know in today's day and age, children have cell phones and the parents will call them direct. But I've also seen children almost immediately burn up their batteries because they're using Facebook and Twitter and taking pictures and all of those things. And if the parents try to get a hold of the child and can't, they're going to need a number to get a hold of the chaperone of that child. When you do overnight trips, and every time we go farther away and for a more extended period of time, it is very important that our plans become more robust. There are just so many more things that we need to train both our students and our chaperones for on these trips. Again, we're going to be fortunate enough that, if we're going to the airport, if we're going to the new World Trade Centers, if we're going to a play downtown, those places already have plans. We need to be aware of what those plans are and what to do in the event of something bad happening. And I can remember early in my teaching career, we were on a field trip to the Center of Science and Industry, and in the middle of the trip, a massive snowstorm was coming in, and we had to make plans to return soon, which meant bringing buses back, so we had to have a plan in place. So when you're traveling by commercial vehicles, make sure that you as the organizer of the trip and all the chaperones know what the emergency plans are. It would be best practices to have every one of your staff and chaperone trained in first aid and CPR. It is important that you have first aid kits. It is important that you know where hospitals are and who's going to go with the child if the child needs to be hospitalized. We were on a trip in Washington, D.C., and 4 girls sharing a room, horseplay. One of them fell, hit the table between the beds. Fortunately, we had first aid equipment, but that was at the hospital for 5 hours that night. And so we had to make sure an adult went with that child. So you have to have all those plans in place before you go. We've got diabetes. We have children that are on long-term medication, and we need to make sure that those drugs are being taken care of, because you can't say if you have diabetes you can't go on the trip. We have to make sure that we have all of those things in place, and then we need to train our staff. How do you respond? Now, if you're going to another state or your students are going to be overnight somewhere, chaperone phone numbers, student and parent phone numbers. The advisor. Everyone needs to have the advisor's phone number. That means parents, that means students. Everyone has to have their chaperone's numbers. And there has to be a contact number for the school, because if all else fails, I need to be able to get a hold of somebody from the school who can make a decision who is not on the trip. We would give our students ID cards to keep in their wallet and their purse. Okay, they can also take a picture of it with their camera, but basically what it does is it tells the student their school, the contact number, and I know this sounds really silly, but the hotel where they are staying and the address. You know, I think there are 113 Marriott hotels in New York City. So if a child became lost, found a police officer and said, I'm staying at the Marriott, that's really not going to help that officer find out where that child needs to be. When you have a lost or missing child, again, a photo that you can give to law enforcement, a way to get a hold of the parents, letting first responders know what medicines they are on, and if there are any known factors that went into why that child might be missing. So, before we wrap up for Q&A, we've talked about our relationships with first responders, emergency response plans, training, lockdown drills, active shooters, and student off-site travel. Any one of these topics could have very easily have been 45 minutes on their own, but we know that time is of the essence to everyone. So again, I thank you for being here today. I thank LENSEC for providing this opportunity, and if we can answer your questions, we'll do that now.
Okay, we've had a few questions come in, so I'll just ask those to you, Gary, on behalf of the attendees. And the first question is, how do you conduct a drill for active shooter when you might cause fear and parental anger? This is a real situation, but we seem to be so constrained.
Well, and that's where the age appropriateness comes into play. You know, the drill that you might do for a middle school would be 100% different than what you would do for a kindergarten. And I'm telling you, folks, at least up to third grade, I don't know if I would use the words active shooter during the drill with those children. They can't process that. This is an activity that we would use to keep us safe. And this is where you're going to listen to your teacher, and your teacher will give you instructions. And so for me, that's how you minimize it. The other thing is, bring your parents in. Arm your parents with talking points so that they can have conversations with their children, so that they could say to their child, look, if a bad person ever got in the room, I know I've told you never to fight, but I don't care what you do to be safe. You can throw whatever you want at that bad person. Or they're going to say, I don't want you to do anything. And that's that partnership not only with first responders, but also with parents. It has to be age appropriate, and you want to involve the parents. And I know that we've had some schools and some law enforcement agencies do some silly things where they've frightened children. And it's just, I mean, statistically, you're more likely to win a $10,000 scratch-off lottery ticket than you are to be involved in an active shooter event. Now, that number isn't zero, so we always must be prepared. But let's not overreact, and let's not cause our children to have more fear.
Yeah, and a similar question was asked for elementary settings. I don't know if you need to expound more, but I'll read it. It's the students. Are the students in school during these drills? In the elementary setting, is there the side effect of scaring the children?
Well, like I said, here's what's interesting is, you know, we tell people you have three choices in an active shooter event. You can lock out the bad guy, you can get out to get away from the bad guy, or if you're an educator, you have permission to take out the bad guy. And so what most of our elementary schools do is they just create quiet activities, because there is no you're going to be able to teach little children how to escape a shooter the same way you could an older child. And so they actually just create activities for the children to just remain quiet during the lockdown drill. I was in one school when they were doing their lockdown drill, and the kids, the teacher had a sucker bucket, and she gave each kid a sucker so that they would be quiet. I'm not saying give kids candy. I'm just saying they accomplished what they needed to during the drill without causing fear for the children.
Thank you. Another question, how do you address the drawbacks of red-green cards? This is the card that's notified the shooter that the room is occupied.
Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, in most cases, the shooter is a member of the school. They already know the room is occupied. So that's why they're there. But remember, and we didn't really touch on this because this didn't focus just on the active shooter, we do not have teachers put out red or green cards until after they've been notified that the shooter is down and that law enforcement will be coming room to room. There was a time, probably 10, 15 years ago, we were training people. I think it actually came out of Los Angeles PD, where they were saying put out a card immediately. No, that shouldn't be a concern. The concern is it's for triage after the shooting event is over. Okay.
How often should the various drills be performed, i.e. fire, tornado, evacuation, or lockdown?
In the United States, in the fire codes, it's once in the first 10 days and then once every month. I'm not sure, State of Ohio says you have to have a lockdown drill before December 4th, and most municipalities, most states require you to have a tornado drill during tornado season, which is April, May, June, and July.
Okay, and to what degree should parents be involved in the ERP planning and review process, exercises and drills?
You want to have a qualified parent, and what I mean by qualified parent, a parent who is interested in the safety of the students and the staff. Oftentimes you have with parents, when you're discussing plans, when you're discussing drills, they think about their child only. And what's unique is in schools, parents think about one child. We think about every child. And so if you have got a parent that is only going to think in terms of their child, that's not the person you want. And so generally you want to stay away from the very young children, especially if it's the parent's first child. But if you've got a parent that's been in your school community for a long time, they've been a supporter of the schools, and even though they might have a child in kindergarten, that they're going to they're going to be reasonable in what they believe should happen, then definitely you want to have them on your team because they become an advocate for you as well.
Okay, and is there a way to get a copy of the ERP book that you were showing there as an example?
I can show you an electronic copy. Unfortunately, with that, we actually that you saw, the printed material from Southwestern City Schools, and please remember, Southwestern City Schools is 20,000 students, 34 buildings, etc. We had a grant from the federal government. It was $36,000 to print all of those, and it never would have happened if there wasn't a grant to do that. However, I can send everyone an electronic version through our demo that they can see what those plans are. They could even print out a PDF, but that's about it. They wouldn't be able to edit them to do that, but I can make sure that people get that when I send a follow-up email.
Thank you. What is the best way to get them out of the hallways if something does happen in between classes? When do teachers lock the doors?
What's going to happen is, again, I'm going to go back that this is a rare event, okay, but it does happen. So, when the signal is given for lockdown, and, unfortunately, it's not going to be, someone getting on the PA going lockdown, 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 although that's what we practice. Let's say that you're using a micro whistle to alert or whatever. Teachers need to be standing there and literally pulling kids into their room until they have to shut the door. And so, you know, I always talk about, you know, if you truly want to prevent active shooter situations, one of the things we must do is have teachers standing out in the hallway between class changes. Because if the event occurs then, the teachers are already there. The teachers can talk to students. They can build positive relations, but if they have to clear the halls, they're right there. They can start to do that.
And what is the best way to end a lockdown, since you shouldn't use announcements or alarms?
So after Sandy Hook, one of the things that came out of the lessons learned from Sandy Hook is, you know, when I took my quad training after Columbine, they said, you know, when you get to a classroom, slide your business card under the door. Well, the teachers weren't believing that. So the methods that we use is, and first of all, what you do in practice and training, you'll do in real life. So you got to make sure that, you know, when you've got to train like you're in the real game. And so use the mass notification system and send a text message to all the teachers. Have a secretary from your central office or district service center send an email message to everybody from outside of your building. What we teach people is this: if it's the real active shooter event, these are the 4 ways that we're going to notify you. We're going to use the mass notification system. We're going to use an email from outside of the building where you're in. We're going to use PA speakers from the first responder vehicles outside. And if you still aren't sure if it's safe, we want you to call 911, because the dispatch center will know when the shooter is down and when the officers are making entry into the room, because they're going to report that on the radio. And all of those came out of lessons learned from Sandy Hook.
I think we've got time for another question. If teachers are to ignore announcements, how do you let them know when the threat is gone? Can you use an announcement with the code green or some previously agreed code word?
Now, here's the problem. The events are so rare that no one will remember the code. Also, in the incident command system, you are specifically directed not to use codes, and that's why we use the announcement systems. Now, what some schools do, because they don't have the luxury of being able to, they don't have the ability to use their mass notification system, or they can't get someone from central office to send an email. What they'll do is they invite first responders, which is a great idea, to their drills, and then they give first responders the keys, and the first responders and the school administrators go room to room and unlock the doors and tell them that the event is over.
Okay, thank you, Gary. That will conclude our webinar. Don't forget, we'd like for attendees to complete a quick survey at the end of the webinar. On the survey, you can request a completion certificate. We'll email out the items promised in the webinar, and we'll send answers to all the questions that were provided to us today. Also, we've added a link to access the presentation on SlideShare, and we're also sharing the presentation through the GoToWebinar panel. So just find your handouts tab, and then you can download the presentation there right now. This webinar recording is going to be posted on the video archive at lensec.com, and along with other previously recorded webinars that cover a variety of topics related to physical security. So I'd like to take one last opportunity to thank Gary of Safeguard Risk Solutions for taking the time to talk with us today. I'm David with LENSEC. You'll find my contact information on the slide there, along with Gary's. Don't hesitate to reach out to us with any questions that you may have or need via phone or email. If either of us can help you, just let us know. So that wraps up our webinar. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and we'll see you again next month. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.